Hello, scholars! My name is Dr. Karis Dillon, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we covered the Great Depression. In this video, we're going to take a look at World War II and America's involvement in this devastating event. So let's begin. After World War I, many European nations knew how fragile peace was and how quickly war could begin. On August 27, 1928, the French foreign minister, whose name was Aristide-Briand, invited 13 nations to Paris, including the U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg, to sign a treaty, which would make war almost impossible. This treaty that was signed was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Aristide-Briand's original goal was to create an alliance with just the U.S. as well as a few other Eastern European nations, but Kellogg agreed to signing a treaty only if more nations were invited. The signing of treaties helped to keep the peace between various European nations, but they weren't binding agreements. The government of the U.S. was fine with loaning money to various European nations as well as signing treaties, but they really hoped to stay out of any future conflicts that European nations had with each other. The U.S. had lost too many lives in World War I, and one of the only positive aspects of its involvement was the huge war debt that other European nations now owed the U.S. World War I had destroyed thousands of miles of European land, and now they needed money to rebuild their nation. Not only did Americans gain money through loans provided to various European nations, they also put in place a high tariff. The Hawley-Smoot tariff was passed in 1930 and helped America to raise even more money. As European nations struggled to rebuild, they asked America to forgive their war debts, but the U.S. refused. There was no way Germany could repay its war debts without borrowing money from the U.S. and using this money to repay its debts. It was a cycle that proved to be disastrous. When the stock market crashed in 1929, America had to stop loaning money to European countries. It didn't take long for Germany to begin defaulting on its loans. When President Franklin Roosevelt realized that European nations could no longer pay their debts, he started creating better relationships with the countries of Latin America. He created a good neighbor policy, which meant apologizing for attempting to control their countries in the past. The U.S. agreed not to intervene in Cuba when it signed the Platt Amendment, and it lessened its influence in Panama. By 1936, the government ordered that no American soldiers would be present in any Latin American nations. Within 2 years, Mexico decided to nationalize its oil, and America had to renegotiate its terms with Mexico. Trade increased substantially during the 1930s with Latin America, which greatly helped America to stay afloat during the Great Depression. In exchange, America agreed to defend the Western Hemisphere in case of military conflict. Even though the U.S. had generally a peaceful alliance with Latin America, it struggled with its relationship with Japan. The island nation of Japan had always lacked raw materials and resources, and because of this had its eye on China. In 1921, the U.S. hosted a Washington Disarmament conference with 9 different nations, including Japan, to decrease tensions in the area. The U.S. and Japan had begun building their navies at a phenomenal rate, and the U.S. wanted to slow this action because of financial concerns. The 9 nations involved were able to sign an agreement of naval disarmament, which meant the Americans, British, and the Japanese would agree to scrap battleships. The 5-power treaty used the ratio of 5 to 5 to 3, which meant America and Great Britain would scrap 5 of their battleships if Japan agreed to scrap 3. The treaty was a success, but this didn't stop nations from disarming or scrapping submarines, cruisers, or destroyers. The treaty agreement worked for almost a decade until September 1931 when the Japanese brutally attacked Manchuria, violating the Kellogg-Briand Pact as well as the 9-power treaty. The Japanese knew they needed more raw materials and resources, so they refused to even acknowledge the violations. Americans really didn't pay attention, though, to foreign affairs during the Great Depression. They really wanted to stay out of European conflict and focus on their own country and its economic problems. The U.S. government did realize that there were 3 extremely powerful and dictatorial leaders gaining popularity in their nations and in the world. In Italy, a man by the name of Benito Mussolini gained power and became the nation's leader in 1935. Japan was another nation whose government drastically changed during the 1930s. Japanese militarists began gaining leadership positions by scaring and sometimes assassinating their opponents. When enough military leaders had gained power, Japan decided to invade China, and World War II began in the Pacific stages of the conflict. The most dangerous leader gaining power during the 1920s and the 1930s was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was born to Clara Wurzel and Alois Hitler on April 20, 1889. He was the fourth of 6 children born in a small town in Austria on the border of Germany. His father was a state customs official and was very harsh with his children, especially Adolf. The future leader of Germany would spend most of his childhood in Linz, in Australia, and would eventually drop out of school. Adolf Hitler wanted to be an artist, and his father came down on him hard for it. He wasn't accepted into the Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts, but he still moved there and tried to make a living out of painting and then selling those images. During those years in Vienna, Hitler was very lonely, and when he wasn't painting, he was reading, and that's where he became very interested in politics. This is when he started to develop ideas on how Germany could thrive as a nation again. This is when Hitler's ideology about the Nazi movement began to grow. In 1913, Hitler moved to Germany, to the city of Munich. It was only a couple months before World War I broke out, and Hitler was able to join the German military under a reserve infantry regiment. His unit was deployed in 1914, and he earned 2 different medals for bravery. One of the medals was called the Iron Cross First Class, and Hitler wore this medal almost every single day until he died. Hitler was injured in World War I twice, and during his second stay in the hospital, it was here that he learned about Germany's defeat. Hitler did not want to believe that the Allies had been successful in defeating the Germans, but believed that weak Germans, or traitors, were responsible for Germany's downfall. When Hitler finally recovered from his injury, he moved back to Munich in 1918 and joined the German Workers' Party. This is where he started speaking, and his oratory skills and energy led him to leadership positions within the party. Hitler decided to rename the party the Nazi Party and adopted the symbol of the Hakenkreuz, hooked cross, as its emblem. The symbol started as a representation of German nationalism, but ended up as a symbol of terrorism, hatred, and violence. It wasn't difficult for Hitler to gain popularity, as the German people recognized the unfair terms of the Versailles Treaty. When Ernst Röhm joined the Nazi Party, he brought in squads of individuals who'd be known as the Sturmabteilung, also known as the SA. These men were used as a means of defense for leaders of the Nazi Party and attacked those that opposed them. November 8, 1923, Hitler and many SA members pushed into a beer hall where another political leader was giving a speech to a crowd. Hitler raised his hand, which had a pistol in it, and told the people that a German revolution was about to begin, and had the people follow him into Munich, where him and his other followers started a gunfight with the German police. Hitler and some of the other leaders were arrested, but the nation of Germany definitely knew Hitler's name after this incident. Hitler was brought before the German court system and was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He would only serve a portion of this sentence, and it was during this time that he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in 1925. This was the first time Hitler put into writing his strongly anti-Semitic and nationalistic ideologies. It was in this book that he wrote about his plans for Germany and its future. The book didn't become popular right away, but gained a huge following near the 1940s. Hitler became very obsessed with the idea that there was a superior race that existed on the earth. With this, he believed that there was only one true leader that could bring about Germany's greatness, and this leader would be called the Fuhrer. When Hitler finally got out of prison, he recognized that the economy had gotten a bit better and decided to work his philosophy on those that were younger and more influential. Hitler also established the SS, Schutzstaffel, which would take the place of the SA, but be much more obedient to him. His SS only wore black and had to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler. He continued to work on more conservative members of the German population to gain popularity. In 1932, Hitler decided to run for president and earned about 37% of the vote. With the economic problems of the 1930s, it was difficult for any chancellor to keep control of the nation. After 3 chancellors failed, Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor in January of 1933. From this position, Hitler was able to gain absolute power over the nation because those that opposed him didn't know how to deal with him. Strangely, a fire started in Germany's parliamentary building called the Reichstag, and in March, Hitler pushed the Reichstag to pass the Enabling Act, giving him all presiding powers. Once Hitler established himself as the supreme power and the Nazi Party as the party in charge, he then was able to move on to the next stage of his plan. Hitler would gain territory for the ultimate Aryan race. Adolf Hitler was smart enough to preach peace and disarmament to foreign countries, but he knew his real goal was expansion. Slowly but surely, Germany became more militarized and eventually withdrew from the League of Nations. In what became known as Night of the Long Knives, Hitler had leaders and problematic members of the Nazi Party assassinated on June 29, 1934. After this incident, it was agreed upon that the President and Chancellor positions would now become one, and Hitler would be the Fuhrer. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please click that like button and don't forget to subscribe. We're going to be moving on to more parts of World War II, and there's a lot more information coming, so feel free to leave comments below, or if you have any questions or comments, and I am definitely here and watch over those comments. So I hope you have a wonderful day. Take good care of yourselves and stay safe, and I will talk with you tomorrow.